When airport security at Dallas-Fort Worth International chose her for a random screening for the third consecutive time that Tuesday morning, no one imagined that this black woman in a navy blue suit with an executive briefcase under her arm was exactly the person with enough power to transform all that humiliation into a lesson no one would ever forget. What happened in the following minutes not only changed the careers of everyone involved, but also exposed a pattern of discrimination that had been happening silently for years in that terminal. This is the story of how a simple radio revealed the truth at the most unlikely moment possible, and how justice sometimes arrives exactly when you least expect it. Denise Crawford was 48 years old and had dedicated the last 2 decades of her life to aviation security, starting as an inspector at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport until reaching the position of National Director of the Transportation Security Administration, the highest-ranking position in the agency responsible for all airport security operations across the United States. That September morning, she was at Dallas-Fort Worth for an emergency meeting with federal authorities about new security protocols that would be implemented at all major airports nationwide. She wore an impeccable executive suit, carried an Italian leather briefcase that her husband had given her for their last anniversary, and wore a discreet pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. Her posture was upright, her gaze steady, and any minimally attentive person would notice that this woman was not an ordinary passenger. But security agent Marcus Sullivan, a white man with broad shoulders and a perpetually bored expression at 43 years old, didn't bother to notice any of this when he pointed at Denise and said loudly enough for half a dozen people around to hear that she had been selected for an additional security check. It was the 3rd time that same morning Denise had gone through this. The first had been right at the terminal entrance, when another agent separated her from the line and went through every pocket of her carry-on luggage, while other white passengers passed straight through without even a second glance. The second was at the metal detector, where a female agent insisted on running the manual detector over her entire body even after she had passed through the scanner without triggering any alarms. And now, already inside the boarding area, just 15 minutes before her flight, Marcus Sullivan had chosen her again from a crowd of at least 50 people for what he called a routine random inspection. Denise knew perfectly well what was happening because she had seen this thousands of times throughout her career, had read hundreds of reports about racial profiling, and had even personally fired 3 supervisors for discriminatory practices at airports under her jurisdiction. But one thing was reading about it in official documents. Another completely different thing was being on the other side, feeling in her skin the weight of that gaze that reduced her to nothing more than the color of her skin. Marcus gestured impatiently for her to approach, and Denise obeyed, maintaining the calm and dignity that had always been her trademark even in situations of extreme pressure. He didn't ask permission, didn't offer any detailed explanation, simply began rummaging through her briefcase, as if he had every right in the world to invade her personal space without any real justification. He opened the main compartment, shuffled through documents, pulled out her laptop and examined it from all angles, as if expecting to find something incriminating hidden among the airport security reports she carried. Denise observed silently while he leafed through her planner, opened her makeup case, and even shook her wallet hoping something would fall out. Around them, other passengers watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment, some quickly looking away when Denise made eye contact, others whispering among themselves with that expression of those who witness something wrong but prefer not to get involved. A blonde woman in a floral dress clutched her purse tighter and quickened her pace as she passed them, as if mere proximity to that search could contaminate her somehow. When Marcus finally finished searching the briefcase and found absolutely nothing beyond work documents, he looked at Denise with an expression that mixed disappointment and irritation, as if she had made him waste time purposely by not carrying anything illegal with her. But instead of releasing her, he crossed his arms and said he needed to ask some additional questions, and it was at that moment that Denise felt the anger begin to boil inside her. Not an explosive and uncontrolled anger, but rather that type of cold and calculated indignation that comes when you realize you are being treated as a criminal simply for existing. She had two options at that moment. She could reveal who she was, show her credentials, and watch Marcus pale when he realized the size of the mistake he was making, or she could let this continue, document every second of that humiliation, and use everything as evidence of the systemic problem she had been trying to combat for years. Denise chose the second option because she knew that isolated cases were easy to dismiss as misunderstandings or individual excesses, but a documented pattern of discrimination involving a federal authority was impossible to ignore. Marcus began asking questions with a condescending tone that made each word sound like a veiled accusation. He asked what the purpose of her trip was, how long she intended to stay in Dallas, if she was carrying large amounts of cash, if anyone had given her any packages to transport. These were standard questions that any security agent could ask, but the way he asked them, the way he looked her up and down between one question and another, the way he paused expecting her to stumble over her own words, all of that made it clear that he had already decided she was suspicious before she even opened her mouth. Denise answered each question with monumental patience, her voice firm and clear, her eyes fixed on his without showing any sign of intimidation. She said she was on a business trip, that she would stay only 2 days, that she wasn't carrying cash beyond the $200 allowed, and that all luggage was exclusively hers. Marcus wrote everything down in a small notebook as if he were recording a criminal's confessions. And then he asked the question that finally broke the thin layer of patience Denise still maintained. He asked, with a little corner-of-the-mouth smile that made it clear he thought he was being clever, if she was sure she had paid for the ticket with her own money, or if someone had paid for her. The insinuation was so obvious and so offensive that Denise felt blood rush to her face, but she maintained her composure, took a deep breath, and responded with an icy calm that ticket had been paid for by the federal agency for which she worked, and that he was welcome to verify that information if he had any doubts. Marcus narrowed his eyes, clearly uncomfortable with her confident response, and then he said something that crossed all acceptable limits. He said that women like her frequently tried to enter the country using other people's documentation, and that he had every right to verify if she really was who she said she was. The phrase "women like her" echoed in the tense silence that settled between them, and Denise knew at that exact moment that this had stopped being just a poorly conducted security procedure to become something much more sinister and deeply wrong. It was at that moment that Sarah Martinez, a Hispanic supervisor of 37 years who had worked in that terminal for 9 years and had always prided herself on maintaining rigorous ethical standards, noticed what was happening on the other side of the corridor and walked toward them with an expression of genuine concern on her face. Sarah had noticed Denise being stopped 3 times that morning because she herself was responsible for monitoring the security cameras and had seen the entire sequence of events unfold on the screens in front of her. She approached Marcus and asked in a low voice if there was any real problem that justified that third search or if he was just following a hunch, and the way she emphasized the word hunch made it clear she knew exactly what was happening. Marcus turned to her with a defensive expression and said he was just doing his job, that this passenger had been randomly selected by the system, and that he had full authority to conduct additional checks whenever he deemed necessary. Sarah looked at Denise, then at Marcus, and then she did something few supervisors would have the courage to do in front of other employees. She asked to see the random selection report that supposedly had indicated Denise as a search target. Marcus hesitated. His hand went to the radio attached to his belt, and he muttered something about not needing to justify his procedures to anyone. But Sarah kept her hand extended, waiting for the document, and her posture made it clear she wasn't going to back down. That's when a voice crackled on Marcus's radio, a firm female voice that belonged to shift coordinator Jennifer Morrison, a white woman of 51 years who commanded that sector with an iron fist and had a reputation for protecting her subordinates even when they were clearly wrong. Jennifer asked over the radio if there was any problem with the passenger in the additional check, and Marcus, visibly relieved to have backup arriving, responded that everything was under control and that he just needed a few more minutes to complete the procedure. But Sarah, who was tired of seeing this type of situation repeat itself, and knew that if she didn't act at that moment, the opportunity to do the right thing would be lost forever, grabbed her own radio and said with a voice that admitted no contradiction that actually there was a problem and that Jennifer needed to come personally to Gate 19 immediately. The atmosphere became extremely tense in the following minutes while they waited for Jennifer to arrive, and Denise took advantage of that moment to observe everything around her with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades analyzing security procedures and identifying systemic failures. She noticed that of the 18 passengers who had passed through that area in the last 12 minutes, only she and a young Latino man with a humble appearance had been stopped for additional checks, while several white passengers, including 2 men with visibly disheveled appearances and nervous behavior, had passed without even a second glance. She noticed that Marcus maintained aggressive and intimidating body language with her, but had been cordial and even friendly with a white female passenger he had helped locate the boarding gate minutes earlier. She noticed that other security agents in the area avoided looking in their direction, as if they already knew what was happening but preferred to pretend they saw nothing. And she noticed, with a mixture of sadness and determination, that this was not an isolated situation caused by a single problematic agent, but rather a reflection of an institutional culture that allowed and even encouraged that type of discriminatory behavior. Jennifer finally appeared, walking quickly down the corridor with an expression that made it clear she was irritated at being called to solve what she probably considered a minor problem. She greeted Marcus with a nod, completely ignored Denise, and asked Sarah what exactly was the problem that justified interrupting her meeting. Sarah, maintaining an admirable professional calm despite the obvious tension in the situation, explained that this passenger had been subjected to 3 separate searches the same morning without there being any documented justification for any of them, that Marcus couldn't present the random selection report when requested, and that the entire procedure seemed to be violating the protocols established by the TSA itself about racial profiling. Jennifer listened to everything with an increasingly closed expression, and when Sarah finished speaking, the coordinator turned to Denise for the first time and asked with a tone that barely disguised her impatience if she was complaining about the treatment she had received or if this was just Sarah, being overly cautious as always. Denise looked at Jennifer for a long moment, carefully weighing her next words, and then she said with a calm voice but loaded with undeniable authority that she wasn't complaining about anything, that she perfectly understood the challenges of maintaining airport security, and that she was sure this was all just a big misunderstanding that could be easily resolved. The way she spoke, the weight she put on each word, made Jennifer frown and look at her more carefully, as if she finally realized there was something different about this passenger. Marcus, however, interpreted Denise's response as submission and said with a triumphant tone that she was free to go and that he hoped she understood they were just doing their job to keep everyone safe. He even smiled when he said this, that kind of condescending smile that people in positions of power give when they think they've won a dispute, and it was exactly at that moment that the radio attached to Jennifer's belt crackled with a message that would completely change the course of that situation. The voice that came from the radio belonged to David Richardson, the regional director of the TSA for all of North Texas, a 58-year-old man whom Denise had known personally for at least 17 years of international meetings and conferences on airport security. David had been looking for Denise for 25 minutes because she should have arrived at the conference room at 9 in the morning, and it was already past 9:25, and he was getting worried, thinking that maybe she had missed her connecting flight or faced some problem. His message was clear and direct, transmitted on an open channel so that all shift supervisors could hear. He was looking for Director Denise Crawford of the Transportation Security Administration, who should have arrived at the domestic terminal half an hour ago for a high-level meeting about new security protocols. And he needed someone to verify if she had already arrived and escort her immediately to the conference room because there were federal authorities from multiple agencies waiting for her. The silence that followed that transmission was so deep and absolute that Denise could hear the distant hum of planes taking off outside and the accelerated beating of her own heart echoing in her ears. She saw the color completely disappear from Marcus's face as he looked at the radio, as if that object had just personally betrayed him. Saw Jennifer become completely paralyzed with her mouth slightly open and eyes wide with pure shock. Saw Sarah close her eyes for a brief second, as if silently thanking for having made the right decision to intervene when there was still time. And then Denise, with a calm and dignity that brutally contrasted with the visible panic stamped on the faces in front of her, calmly opened her executive briefcase, took out a black leather credential holder with the golden TSA seal, and opened it very slowly, revealing her complete official identification with photo, position, and all international authorizations that accredited her as one of the principal authorities in airport security for the entire nation. You know that moment when you realize the world is watching and that your story can make a difference in someone's life? If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story touched you in some special way. Don't let that feeling pass. Grab your phone right now, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us if you've ever been through something similar or if you know someone who lived through an injustice situation like this. Your story matters, your voice matters, and when we share these experiences, we create a chain of support that can change everything. And look, I read every comment, every story you share here, because that's what makes this channel truly meaningful. Let's go together to the end of this story, because what's still going to happen will leave you speechless. Jennifer grabbed the radio with trembling hands and responded with a voice she tried to keep firm, but that came out choppy and visibly nervous, that Director Crawford was there with her at Gate 19 and that they would escort her immediately to the conference room. David responded saying he was sending 2 senior agents to get her, and that he wanted a complete report on what had caused the delay in her movement to the meeting area. Jennifer turned off the radio, and the silence that settled among the 4 was so loaded with tension that it seemed the air had become heavier and harder to breathe. Marcus was visibly sweating, his forehead shining under the terminal's fluorescent lights, and his hands trembling slightly as he tried to think of something, anything he could say, to begin fixing the monumental disaster he had created. Jennifer opened and closed her mouth several times like a fish out of water, trying to find words that could somehow minimize the gravity of what had happened. But there were no words for that, and she knew it. It was Denise who finally broke the silence, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was in it a weight of authority and disappointment that made even Sarah, who had tried to do the right thing, shrink slightly. Denise said that in the last 95 minutes, she had been subjected to 3 completely unjustified searches, had her luggage rummaged through 3 times, had been questioned about the origin of the money she carried and about the legitimacy of her ticket, had been insinuated that she might be using false documentation, and had been treated like a potential criminal simply because her appearance didn't fit the profile that those agents considered appropriate for a business-class passenger. She said she had tried to maintain calm and composure because she understood that mistakes happen and that the work of airport security is extremely challenging, but that what she had witnessed that morning were not isolated errors, but rather a systematic pattern of racial discrimination that violated not only TSA guidelines but also international human rights agreements that the United States had signed. Marcus tried to defend himself, saying he was just following standard procedures and that the selections were really random, but his voice came out weak and without conviction because everyone there knew that was a lie. Denise didn't raise her voice, didn't make any dramatic gesture, simply looked at him with an expression that mixed deep disappointment and fatigue, and asked if he really believed what he was saying or if he was just trying to convince himself he hadn't done anything wrong. She asked how many white passengers he had stopped for additional search that morning, and Marcus couldn't answer. She asked if he had the habit of questioning white business-class passengers about the origin of their money or about who had paid for their tickets, and Marcus looked away. She asked if he could see the problem in the fact that of the 18 passengers who had passed through that area in the last half hour, only the 2 non-white passengers had been stopped and searched, and Marcus remained silent because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't incriminate him even more. Jennifer tried to take control of the situation, saying she was sure this was all a big misunderstanding and that they would conduct a complete investigation to clarify what had happened. But Denise interrupted her with an educated but non-negotiable firmness, saying there would be no need for investigation because everything had been captured by the security cameras and because she herself had documented each interaction with detailed notes, including times and names of everyone involved. She said those recordings and notes would be included in the official report she would present at the meeting she was about to attend, a meeting that included not only TSA authorities, but also representatives from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and aviation security agencies from multiple states. Jennifer paled completely when she understood the implications of that, realizing the incident wouldn't be restricted to an internal complaint that could be hushed up or minimized, but rather would become part of an official federal report that would be reviewed by dozens of authorities from multiple agencies. It was at that moment that the 2 senior agents sent by David Richardson arrived at Gate 19, both wearing dark suits and federal identifications hanging from their necks, and one of them, a gray-haired Hispanic man named Roberto Fuentes, who had worked directly with Denise at 3 previous conferences, opened a genuine smile of recognition when he saw her. Roberto greeted Denise warmly, asked about her husband and how the flight from Atlanta had been, and completely oblivious to the tension in the air, commented that David was anxious to discuss with her the new screening protocols that could significantly reduce wait times without compromising security. The naturalness and obvious respect with which Roberto treated Denise created a brutal and impossible-to-ignore contrast with the way Marcus and Jennifer had treated her minutes before, and that contrast made it absolutely clear to any observer that the problem wasn't in Denise not seeming worthy of respect, but rather in the prejudice and lack of professionalism of those who should be ensuring fair and equitable treatment for all passengers. When Roberto noticed the tension and asked if something had happened, Denise just said she would explain everything at the meeting and that they should go because they were already late. But before leaving, she turned to Sarah and said sincerely that she appreciated her courage in intervening when she saw something was wrong, that this type of professional integrity was exactly what the airport security industry needed, and that she hoped Sarah would continue defending what was right, even when it was difficult. Sarah seemed genuinely moved by those words, and could only nod, her eyes slightly bright. Then Denise looked at Marcus and Jennifer and said something that would echo in their minds for a long time. She said she hoped they would use that experience to reflect on their own prejudices and on how their actions affected real people with real lives and dignity that deserved to be respected, and that she sincerely hoped they would become better people and better professionals after that day. The walk to the conference room was silent, with Roberto and the other agent escorting Denise through restricted corridors, while she mentally reorganized the presentation she had prepared, knowing that now she would have to include an entire section about her own experience that morning as a vivid and undeniable example of why new training protocols on implicit bias and racial profiling weren't just recommendations, but urgent necessities. When they entered the conference room, David Richardson immediately stood up and walked toward her with an expression of genuine concern, asking if everything was okay and what had caused the delay. Denise looked around the room and saw at least 23 people sitting waiting for her, including high-ranking federal authorities, security directors from major airlines, and representatives from aviation agencies from several states, and she knew this was the right moment and the right audience to transform her personal humiliation into a tool for institutional change. She asked David to play the security camera footage from Gate 19 from the last 2 hours before they started the official meeting. David seemed confused, but agreed. And minutes later, everyone in the room was watching in silence the images of Denise being stopped 3 consecutive times, being searched, being questioned, being treated with distrust and disrespect, while white passengers passed freely in the background of the scenes. The silence in the room while the images rolled was absolute and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the occasional sound of someone shifting in their chair or letting out a sigh of disbelief. When the images ended, Denise began her presentation not with the technical slides she had prepared about new screening protocols, but rather with a simple and devastating question. If this had happened to her, a federal director of airport security on an official trip, how many times a day did this happen to ordinary passengers who didn't have credentials, who didn't have authority, who didn't have a voice to defend themselves, and who simply accepted that humiliation as the inevitable price of traveling while Black or Hispanic or Muslim or anything else that didn't fit the narrow profile that some agents considered safe? The meeting that should have lasted 2 hours ended up extending for almost 6. And what had been planned as a technical discussion about screening procedures transformed into a deep and sometimes painful conversation about systemic prejudice, about how the legitimate search for security had been distorted in some places to justify discrimination, and about the urgent need to reformulate not only training protocols, but also supervision and accountability systems. Denise presented data she had collected over years showing clear patterns of racial profiling at airports across the country, including documented cases where non-white passengers were searched at rates 4 to 5 times higher than white passengers, even controlling for factors like destination, ticket type, and observable behavior. She showed studies that demonstrated racial profiling not only violated fundamental rights, but was also completely ineffective from a security standpoint, because it forced agents to waste time and resources on targets chosen based on appearance, while real potential threats went unnoticed. David Richardson, to his credit, didn't try to minimize or defend what had happened. He publicly acknowledged in front of everyone present that the incident that morning was unacceptable, that it represented serious failures in both training and supervision, and that immediate measures would be taken to ensure similar situations didn't repeat themselves. He announced that Marcus Sullivan would be immediately removed from passenger contact functions while a complete investigation was conducted, that Jennifer Morrison would be subjected to mandatory additional training on implicit bias and proper supervision, and that all agents at that terminal would undergo a complete reassessment of their practices with specific focus on identifying and eliminating racial profiling. But Denise made it clear she wasn't just interested in punishing individuals, because individuals were symptoms of a much larger problem, and that what she really wanted to see was structural change that would make it impossible for cases like that to happen in the first place. The following weeks were turbulent and intense. The story of what had happened to Denise leaked to the press, probably through some airport employee who had witnessed part of the situation or heard about it through internal gossip, and suddenly the incident was in all the major newspapers and news programs. The headlines varied from sensationalist to genuinely reflective, but all captured the basic essence of the situation. A high-ranking airport security authority had been subjected to the exact type of discriminatory treatment she spent her career combating, and that brutal irony had exposed in an impossible-to-ignore way the reality of racial profiling at airports. Denise gave some carefully selected interviews where she emphasized that her story wasn't special or unique, that the only difference between her and millions of other non-white passengers who went through this every day was that she had the platform and credibility to make her voice heard, and that the real objective shouldn't be just to remedy what had happened to her, but rather to create systems that protected all passengers from that type of treatment. Public reaction was intense and divided in predictable ways. Many people, especially Black people and other minorities who had lived similar experiences, shared their own stories of being stopped, searched, questioned, and treated with suspicion at airports simply because of their skin color or appearance. These stories flooded social media, creating a wave of personal testimonies that made it impossible for any person of good faith to deny there was a real and deep systemic problem. Others, however, defended the security agents, arguing they had a difficult job and that sometimes mistakes happened under pressure, conveniently ignoring the fact that consistently choosing non-white people for searches wasn't a mistake, but a pattern. There were also those who accused Denise of exaggerating or using her position to gain attention, comments that only proved the point she was trying to make about how black people's experiences of discrimination are frequently discredited or minimized, even when there is clear and indisputable evidence. Marcus Sullivan was formally fired 4 weeks after the incident, after the internal investigation revealed that this hadn't been an isolated case, but rather part of a behavior pattern that included at least 19 other documented occasions where he had stopped non-white passengers without adequate justification. Jennifer Morrison was demoted from her coordinator position and transferred to administrative functions without direct passenger contact, a decision she initially tried to contest but ended up accepting when it became clear the alternative would be complete termination. Sarah Martinez, on the other hand, received formal recognition for her professional conduct and was promoted to a newly created position of Ethics and Compliance Supervisor, where she would be responsible for monitoring interactions between agents and passengers to identify and prevent cases of discriminatory treatment. The irony that doing the right thing had been rewarded while doing the wrong thing had been punished didn't go unnoticed and served as an important signal to other airport employees about what type of behavior was truly valued by the institution. But the most significant change didn't happen at the individual level, but rather at the systemic level. The TSA, under intense public pressure and aware that similar cases would continue emerging if nothing changed structurally, implemented a series of comprehensive reforms. All agents at all airports across the United States were required to undergo renewed and expanded training on implicit bias, racial profiling, and equitable treatment of passengers, with special emphasis on recognizing and interrupting their own unconscious prejudices. New supervision protocols were established requiring that all additional searches be documented with clear justification and subsequently reviewed by supervisors trained in identifying discriminatory patterns. An anonymous reporting system was created, allowing passengers to report treatment they considered unfair or discriminatory without fear of retaliation or being labeled as problematic. And perhaps most importantly, the agency established a permanent security practices review committee that included not only TSA employees, but also civil rights advocates, representatives from minority communities, and social psychology experts who studied prejudice and discrimination. Denise continued her work as she always had, traveling between different states and attending meetings about airport security. But now she carried with her not only her official credentials, but also the visceral experience of having been on the other side of that system she helped administer. That experience fundamentally changed something in how she approached her work, making her even more determined and even more focused on ensuring security systems were not only effective, but also fair and respectful to all human beings regardless of their appearance. She began including in all her presentations a section about her own experience in Dallas, not out of pride or to seek sympathy, but rather as a powerful educational tool that undeniably demonstrated that the problem of racial profiling wasn't an abstract or theoretical issue, but rather a concrete reality that affected real people in deeply harmful ways. 6 months after the incident, Denise was again in Dallas for another round of meetings, and this time when she went through airport security, the experience was completely different. The agents were professional, polite, and efficient, treating her exactly the same way they treated all other passengers. No one stopped her for unjustified additional searches. No one questioned the origin of her money or the legitimacy of her ticket. No one looked at her with suspicion or treated her as if she didn't belong there. It was such a normal and unremarkable experience that it could have passed completely unnoticed. But for Denise, that normalcy represented exactly the victory she had sought, because the goal had never been to receive special treatment because of her position, but rather to ensure that all people, regardless of race or appearance, received the basic treatment of respect and dignity that every human being deserves. When she arrived at the boarding area and saw Sarah Martinez supervising operations with her new Ethics and Compliance Supervisor badge, the two exchanged a wave and a smile that carried all the shared weight of that difficult morning months ago. Sarah was doing the work she always should have done, using her position to ensure the system functioned the way it should function, and Denise knew that every passenger who passed through that terminal was a little safer not only from physical threats, but also from threats to their dignity, thanks to the silent but crucial work that people like Sarah did every day. They didn't talk that day because both were busy with their respective responsibilities, but they didn't need to talk because the understanding between them was clear and complete. A connection forged in that critical moment when Sarah had chosen to do the right thing, even knowing it could cost her professionally. Denise's story eventually became a case study used in airport security training programs across multiple countries, not just in the United States, but also in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and several European nations facing similar challenges related to racial profiling and discrimination in their own security systems. Universities began including the case in courses on public administration, professional ethics, and social justice, using it as an example of how a single person in a position of authority who refuses to silently accept unjust treatment can catalyze changes that benefit millions. Documentaries were made, academic articles were published, and Denise's experience became part of a much larger conversation about how democratic societies balance the legitimate need for security with the equally important imperative to treat all citizens with fairness and respect. But for Denise personally, the most significant impact wasn't in the formal recognitions or media attention, or even in the policy changes that her experience had helped promote. The most profound impact was in the messages she regularly received from ordinary people who had read about her story and who for the first time felt that someone understood what they went through, that their experiences were valid, that they weren't imagining things or being overly sensitive when they felt they were being treated unfairly because of their skin color. She received emails from Black students who had been stopped and searched at airports on their way to academic conferences, from Hispanic business executives who traveled frequently for work and who had normalized the fact they were always chosen for additional checks, from Muslim women who wore hijab and who had learned to arrive at the airport hours earlier because they knew they would inevitably be selected for extensive searches. Each of these messages was a reminder that the battle was far from over, but also that each small victory, each changed policy, each properly trained agent, made a real difference in the lives of real people. There were also consequences Denise hadn't anticipated, some positive and others more complex. She involuntarily became a public figure in a way she had never sought or desired, recognized at airports and conferences, not just for her work but for the story that had become inseparable from her professional identity. This brought opportunities to amplify her message and influence policies at levels she never would have reached otherwise. But it also meant she could no longer travel anonymously, that every interaction with airport security was observed and commented on, that she had to be constantly aware that she represented something larger than herself. There were moments when she felt the weight of that responsibility as something oppressive, wishing she could simply be Denise again instead of Denise, the director who was racially profiled. But most of the time she accepted that role because she understood that sometimes history chooses people to be symbols of larger causes, and that refusing that role would be wasting an opportunity to make a real difference. 2 years after the incident, Denise was invited to give the keynote speech at a major national airport security conference held in Washington, D.C., where more than 800 professionals from all 50 states gathered to discuss the industry's challenges and best practices. She stepped onto the stage before that huge crowd, the bright lights making it so she could barely see the faces in the audience. And for a moment she allowed herself to remember that morning in Dallas, when she had felt small and invisible and reduced to nothing but the color of her skin. And then she began to speak, and her voice echoed through that immense auditorium as she told her story not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a professional analyzing systemic failures and proposing concrete solutions. She spoke about data and protocols and training, but she also spoke about human dignity and about how systems made by people reflect those people's prejudices unless there are conscious and constant efforts to identify and correct those distortions. When she finished her speech, There was a moment of silence before the audience exploded in applause that continued for several minutes. People stood up, some with tears in their eyes, and Denise understood she had touched something deep, not only in those who had lived similar experiences, but also in well-intentioned professionals who genuinely wanted to do better, but sometimes didn't know how to recognize or combat their own prejudices. After the speech, dozens of people lined up to talk with her, sharing their own stories, asking questions, seeking advice. An Asian American man in his 30s, security manager at an airport in Seattle, told her that her presentation had made him realize patterns in his own practices he had never questioned before, and that he would return home determined to implement changes. A black woman who worked as a security agent in Chicago tearfully recounted that she herself had been racially profiled when traveling on her time off, and that she had lived with that painful contradiction of being part of a system that discriminated against her, and that hearing Denise speak had given her courage to use her voice internally to promote changes. Marcus Sullivan, for his part, disappeared from public life after his termination, and Denise never knew what happened to him after that day. She sometimes wondered if he had learned anything from that experience, if he had done the difficult work of examining his own prejudices and trying to become a better person, or if he had simply become more bitter and convinced himself he was the real victim in all of it. She hoped it was the first case because she genuinely believed people could change and grow if they were willing to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. But she was also realistic enough to know not everyone does that work, and that some prefer to cling to their justifications and their prejudices rather than admit they were wrong. Either way, his fate was no longer her concern, because she had learned over the years that you can't force anyone to change, and that all you can do is create systems and structures that make it harder for problematic people to cause harm and easier for well-intentioned people to do the right thing. Jennifer Morrison remained in her administrative position for about 18 months before quietly retiring early, and while she never publicly apologized or acknowledged her role in what had happened, several former colleagues mentioned she had seemed different in those final months, quieter and more reflective, as if the incident had forced her to confront aspects of herself she had successfully ignored for decades. Sarah Martinez thrived in her new role and became a national advocate for ethical security practices, eventually being recruited to help develop TSA training.